Welcome everyone. Today's topic for the discussion is, if it ain't broken, which suggests that we should be looking upon existing building stock with a different viewpoint. Today we'll be covering the three areas that which adaptive reuse has advantages and disadvantages. These are economic, sustainability, aesthetics, but first of all I'd like to introduce our speakers. To my left, Marc worked as an interior designer prior to the co-founding of the award-winning sustainable furniture studio Schamburg, Alvisse. Milestones for Marc include upcycling waste plastics into high-value corporate seating and becoming Australia's first furniture manufacturer to satisfy the rigorous eco-standards of the Forestry Stewardship Council and Greenpeace. Marc Schamburg. With a wide range of experience from simple to complex buildings and site planning, Peter has a strong design and urban design reputation. His practice with colleagues Brian Zalaika and Tim Greer was formed in 1987 and has maintained a high level of architecture throughout these years. Welcome, Peter Tonkin.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you.
And finally, as another co-founder of eco-design studio Schamburg, Alvisse, whose recent collaboration with Zenith on won the Gold Award in 2018 with the Good Design Australia. Michael works as an innovation facilitator with the Australian Design Centre and enjoys teaming up with business, government and civil society groups to build Sydney's social and economic resilience. Please welcome Michael Alvisse. So my first question, which is really directed towards Peter, and it's a simple one. From an economic perspective, why adaptive reuse instead of new build?
Look, this is a tricky question because I don't know how long I've got to answer it, but I could go on and on. Because it really depends on the building. And up front, of course, you get a brief which you have to answer with a new build or an adaptive reuse. And if the brief kind of fits the existing building, then I think you can look at significant advantages all the way down the track. If the brief doesn't really fit, then you get to a situation where costs and difficulty can mount up. But typically I think you can look at an adaptive reuse requiring more time up front, but often less time on site. Because in theory you're out of the ground, you're weatherproof, and those two big issues of new build where you're messing around in the mud for 6 months don't exist. But you know, there are lots of buts, and it is basically comes down to whether the brief fits into the building neatly or requires unacceptable heritage adaptations, if I can put it like that, that'll start to make consent tricky. But the thing with adaptive reuse, and I think that slide's highly appropriate, is you get a lot for nothing. You get a lot of volume in terms of ceiling heights and spaces, because generally in a new build, you're kind of tailoring everything to the brief and squashing it in. In an adaptive reuse, there's inevitably space left over around the corners, and particularly above your head, that you get for nothing. And the other, really, I think, valuable thing is you get this texture and patina of fabulous detailing, materials that you just can't get anymore, like whopping great pieces of timber. And that's the real value add, I think, that you get more at the end. You get a greater variety of spaces, you get this richness of texture, and you get a kind of instant identity that people often struggle for with new build. It kind of seems often quite forced, where in an adaptive reuse you get it there on a plate.
Yeah, it's funny. I've got a client at the moment who's in the market for a new office. It's about 6,000 square metres, and his tenant rep, he sent him off on a mission to find an existing heritage building. He specifically did not want to move into a new commercial building. And we've started the project, and the budget's incredibly tight. But you'll never notice that at the end of the project, because you inherit so much from the envelope that he's
Whereas you
selected.
probably would if you got a 2.7 metre tiled
ceiling above.
slice of an office building.
Yeah, that's correct.
You only got to look at where architects have their offices.
Yep.
That's true.
Adaptive reuse buildings, by and large.
Yep. So you do approach adaptive reuse from a design process differently than what you would with the new?
Well, that whole brief compliance business, not really.
Right.
You know, you've got to comply with the BCA, you've got to achieve energy standards, you've got to meet the client's brief in terms of fitting X, Y and Z pieces of stuff into the building. But I think with an adaptive reuse you are again 3 steps down the path, and it's not a limitation of creativity, but it's a different sort of creativity. And so as a practice, we've kind of developed a layering approach to adaptive reuse, which preserves as much of the original as you can and layers up the machinery of a new building on top of it.
Yeah.
And it's not the same with every building, because you have to tweak it to the scales and textures of both the brief and the new building. But it is a methodology, if not a strictly aesthetic approach.
Yeah.
And,
So I guess there's other 2 points when it comes to adaptive reuse is sustainability and also heritage, which we haven't really talked much about yet. But
yes.
you know, from I'm just quite interested as to see how much adaptive reuse are actually listed structures.
Well,
all of them?
it's getting to be more and more,
Yep.
because all the things that people can pull down, they have. And I think, you know, someone was at an engineering office the other day was talking about a building they could see out the window that is a relatively anonymous 1920s warehouse building that you wouldn't, you know, is that heritage? People saying, yes, it is, it's listed. And so suddenly you've got to treat it in a different way to what you might do if it wasn't a listed building. And particularly in the inner city areas of Sydney and Melbourne, and to a lesser extent Brisbane, but certainly the other capitals, there are conservation areas that start bringing the same levels of approval constraints, if I can put it like that, that you would get with a new build.
Yeah.
So,
It's an interesting question. What's driving that at a local government or council level to maintain these old buildings? Is it what you said in one of your articles, which was something about the postcard sort of quality of heritage buildings and tourism in countries like Australia or even Europe? Is that what's driving this, do you think, or do they see there's real cultural or economic benefit?
I think there are certainly cultural benefits in getting that sense of being able to see where we came from and using that as a platform to where we're going. And that's on the one hand. I think on the other hand is there's an urbanity, a sensibility about scale and humanity with old buildings that's often completely ignored with new buildings, and you've only got to look at, I don't know, bits of Sydney where there is no sense of heritage at all, and how bad much of it is. And I think of that street behind all the Darling Harbour developments against the light rail, and you think it couldn't be uglier if you tried. And yet, you know, these are the backs of major public buildings interfacing with transport. It ought to be all right, but
It's all new. And
it's all new, and
nobody's
given us stuff about it, basically. And,
Just out of interest, our focus is very much on architecture here. How many people here are not architects?
enough. That's
Quite a
good.
few.
Okay, and out of you guys, how many are in interiors? Okay, fair few. How many are in facilities, building management? No? Any other fields? There's some furniture people that I see.
Heritage people?
Pardon?
Industrial design.
Industrial design. Okay, all right. And then, so we've got a mix of lots of different scales from this.
Yes.
From architecture through to product, interiors. Okay, good. Thank you.
So what you were saying before was interesting to me, because next door to me for the last 2 or 3 years I've been going through a development, and at the initial stages of the DA process it was all rejected because council said it doesn't spec up, it's like you want too much. And what I'm noticing more and more in sort of the inner suburbs is that the developers are proactively trying to gorge themselves on space that they can sell, and they're taking existing buildings, whether they're heritage or not, and kicking the sort of character out of these and trying to, for example, in the case I'm talking about, it was 3 beautiful warehouse buildings on a corner, which they could have turned into maybe 6 or 7 luxury warehouse apartments. But they decided to knock it all down and build 24 apartments, which are all tiny, as you say, 2.6 metre ceilings, tiny footprints, 3,000 Kelvin sort of LED lighting, so it looks like a refrigerator. These sorts of things, but it's all about like mass as opposed to like creating something beautiful.
Well, this was a conversation I was having with you just now, that it's stupid blaming developers because we're all to blame to an extent.
Absolutely.
But we basically need to foster a cultural shift so that people don't view these projects as being too hard, and they don't kind of insist on upfront massive profits but look a bit down the track. And we're talking about a particular developer and development who has a history of upspecing things up front, of making them better right at the planning stage, and he reaps the rewards through better income down the track.
Peter's referring to the Spice Alley development next to Fraser Central Park. And I admitted to him that I was actually a groupie of Spice Alley because there are so few places in Sydney which actually feel quite so alive and so textured and rich.
Yeah, and that's compression too, which
that's
is,
right.
It's hard to get with new build without feeling claustrophobic.
But as Michael's experienced, there's a buzz and excitement because of that compression.
Now, our focus is very much on amazing buildings like the one we're in. Wonderful. 19th century, early 20th century, wonderful. The reality is that the bulk of our building stock is probably 70s, 80s, 90s and beyond.
Yeah, exactly.
They're still standing.
Radius,
So we have all this invested energy, embodied energy, in buildings which are not 3 metres, 4 metres, 6 metre ceilings. They're 2.6, 2.4. That's the reality. How do we look at including those in this conversation? Because that's the bulk of what we actually have. It's not the romantic bit, but it's the reality of it.
Well, again, there was a question, Todd, that we were talking about, that notion of a loose fit, durable envelope to a building, and it's what this building's got. It's a handsome shed that you can put virtually anything in, including carriage building, And a lot of new buildings have been designed so tightly to a particular brief that you can't change them. There are set downs and columns and holes that you just cannot get around. But I'm really enjoying watching the 60s office buildings being turned into apartments, where the floor plates and the core stays and everything else gets changed. And that's adaptive reuse. It's a different type of it.
I mean, existing buildings inherently have a I know a lot of designers and architects raise their eyes, I guess, when they see a brief in an existing building. There's that that old saying, don't work with children, animals and heritage buildings. But there are restrictions or challenges that are raised when working with existing structures and buildings in particular. But as you're talking about, Peter, it's about making sure that there's longevity moving on into the future for a building like that. It has a new function, but let's not back it into a corner so that only one particular function can actually happen in that building. And this is a great example of that. And I think we also see that a lot in workplace design, in commercial interiors, and of course you two would see that a lot in developing some of your ranges at the moment, which really rely on flexible solutions for different types of functions and events within spaces. This is a great precedent.
Well, this is one of the questions you were asking the other day, is like, what ideas or advice do we have to designers and architects who are planning new buildings with future reuse in mind? And obviously one of the biggest comment that I have about that is, in light of the fact that the office is becoming very organic and the furniture that we're now creating replaces rooms in a large extent, so that you can create spaces instead of building walls. Like whether they have a roof or whether they just have high sides, like they're actually spaces. But these are adaptive and relocatable from building to building as well as within the space. How do you plug them in when they're powered? How do you get services to these things if all of the power is in the ceiling or all the power is in the perimeter of the building? So obviously with the newer builds, they're now putting in access floors as standard, so that facilitates that versatility that you need. But what do you do with an old building? And particularly, as Michael's saying, like if it's only got a 2.6 sort of ceiling with a little bit of, air conditioning space above that, how do you do it?
Yeah, well, there's, if you go down the conventional method of fitting out a heritage building like you would a commercial building, you can just automatically add a 30% premium. The build cost is significantly more because you do need to, you can't screw into heritage fabric envelopes. You do need to come up with tricksy clamp details and all those things, and the builders start rubbing their hands together. It does cost a lot more. Therefore I think the better solution is, for when working within existing structures, is to go down the flexible mode anyway. Number one, it's cheaper. Number one, you're doing the right thing by the building. As long as you're getting, the necessary services to the building upgraded, whether it's DDA compliance, putting in accessible lifts, mechanical solutions. Those things can cost a significant amount as it is for the developer, and let alone then go and fit it out. I think Peter's point is very good, that that's important, that we keep these, don't pigeonhole these buildings, don't pigeonhole a function for these buildings. Make sure you've got flexibility so that there's longevity for that moving into the future, into its next phase of its life.
We're starting to see, like, these little pods fascinate me because they're the start of another approach to space planning, where you don't build a room, you create the atmosphere and acoustics and temperature and feel that you want with a piece of furniture. And what an amazing leap of design thinking that is.
Thank you.
And we're just starting to get it, I think, with bathrooms and pods like that, where you can, I just saw a thing where they fitted out 27 bathrooms in a motel somewhere in the suburbs in 3 days. They all came in container-shaped boxes and they slid them in. And if we can project that thinking forward and see buildings as a support structure for pieces of furniture, then you can look at a really durable, long life solution. And
and we should be.
We should be.
Yeah.
How much is this is a question to go, the sort of model of development, whereby a developer develops something, a builder builds something, and then it's hand passed on to someone else. Like that structure and that model, by nature, is going to encourage everyone to cut capital costs, because someone else is going to actually deal with the maintenance costs and the consequences down the track. So it's this thing about washing your hands of the consequences and the costs. Now it's almost, I'm thinking, how on earth do you actually in-build those costs and considerations when the very business model, is set up for maximum profit and minimum cost, and with an absolute understanding that all that responsibility is hand passed to someone else with no flies on you. How do you achieve a better result, given that that's the inherent logic of that system?
Well, we're one of the most regulated countries in the world when it comes to sort of, safety and technology in our buildings. So it's really just another layer of that, which is that if you offer some sort of incentives or regulations around this, then it will start happening. Sorry.
I think it comes from the other end, from the finance side.
You think?
Of people starting to be more scrupulous at the way they look at the asset, this whole asset management bullshit, how they look at the asset and drill into what its genuine ongoing costs are.
Yeah.
And if people, you look at all those apartment buildings where they've built cheaply the threshold between the balcony and the living room, and you've got to come back 10 years later and rip it all up and fix it at a cost of millions to the unit strata owners. And if people realised all of that up front, it would be assessed. And
so is that an opportunity for designers and developers to go, all right, you have two developments here. One where the builder and developer hand pass the problem onto someone else, no responsibility. What will you think as a buyer in terms of what your costs will be versus a development where the developer is actually continuing to manage that and maintain that, and to go, you're now comparing two products. There are two financial products, very different business models, but as a buyer, as an occupant, which one will you actually go, my interests are looked after here as a customer, rather than the shareholder being looked after, which is a very different model, as we've seen with the banks, for instance. The difference between looking after shareholders versus looking after customers. They breed very different behaviours in anyone, in any corporate especially. So is that an opportunity for us to go, how do we start to disrupt
that's what it is.
these economic models,
disruption,
and go, because some people are starting to do that. Someone like Nightingale, for instance, in Melbourne. Is anyone here involved in that, familiar with it at all?
Sort of involved,
Oh, okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about the concept to someone who doesn't know about it?
It's basically where a facilitator don't actually buy the land, but put enough of a deposit in a holding thing with a purchase option to get their hands on a piece of land. They then throw this out to a waiting list of people who've committed to the product. And in Melbourne, there's a long waiting list, so there's not much risk. And they then get them to fund the purchase of the land in dribs and drabs, so they don't have to put the whole cost of the apartment up front. They just put the cost of a deposit on the land, then the land holding costs, then the professional fees, and then they build it with these top-ups of money from the unit holders. And because there aren't risks about not selling them and risks about the whole thing taking too long and developers' profits, they're working out at something like 60 or 70% of the cost of a normal apartment. And people can tailor the development to what they want. So there's been a lot of fuss in Melbourne because typically people have said they don't want car parking. And the local council has said you've got to have car parking, and they've gone up to the Victorian version of the Land and Environment Court and often won without the car parking. Because it's a big cost to put parking in a residential building. If you don't want it, why have it? It hasn't really gotten off the ground in Sydney because of basically the land cost is so high that the bar you've got to jump over on day one is so high that we're basically, my partner's very committed to it as a process. And we've been looking for sites and they just virtually don't exist. So but it's a great model. I think it'll, there's also this new build to rent, which is just starting to happen, where a developer will build a block of apartments and keep them all and rent them out. And sometimes that's done as a collaborative as well, not quite on the Nightingale model, but, and that solves that issue of building in ongoing quality, because people want to know that they're not going to be up for huge maintenance costs.
Now, we haven't really talked much about the sustainability perspective, but do we think that adaptive reuse does get the sustainability credits or kudos that it obviously is amongst the industry and the market?
I don't think so. I've been trying to drill into this with one of my mates who's a sustainability expert, and the whole star rating tools are tailored to very conventional approaches to development. So they assume if you have a house, you will air condition it if it's too hot in summer and cold in winter. They don't assume you'll open the windows. So you get very conventional outcomes to achieve star ratings, and you can blow it apart if you do the hard work. But if you just follow the, step procedure, you don't. And in our experience, where if you simply looked at the cubic meterage of stuff in a building, there's a lot less required in a new adaptive reuse than there is in a new build, and you ought to get credits for it. But,
I was under the understanding that you got sort of instant full points depending on how much you reuse. So in furniture, if you reuse a piece of furniture in a fit out, you get 100% points for that piece straight away. So you're saying that's not the case?
But they're just one category.
Yeah, it's just one. It's just one of many categories, as like the furniture. In the interiors ratings, this is one of many. And look, a lot of people get that credit because they do usually bring along. They've usually got a nice selection of task chairs or something like that 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 might make up a fair significant amount of their budget. So of course they'll bring it over and they get credits on that anyway. In terms of sustainability or reuse perspective, in your past, guys, what's been some of your highlights in furniture design in terms of reuse of materials or products?
Well, probably the biggest sort of example that we could present there is of our O50 chair, and O50 stands for Original 50s. And it was a bit of a play really, because we were just starting to get into this sort of sustainable thing and trying to be very green and trying to work out the difference between being sustainable as opposed to recycling things. And this opportunity came up where we found a recycled design and a recycled, or an existing, should I say, moulding tool, and then a material that could be sort of completely used 100% to make a new shell. So it came about this idea for us, like a symbol or a metaphor for upcycling, where we created a chair that was not only a recycled product, but it was a recycled design. We didn't actually come up with the design. What we added to it was the idea and the story and the marketing behind it, and presented that. And of course a lot of people said, well, why are you doing that? It's an old 50s chair. We don't want old 50s chairs. We want new things, give us new stuff. That's always the question when someone rings up your office is, what's new? And you go, well, I got this really old chair from the 50s that you might want.
It's got new materials.
But it's got new materials there. But it ended up becoming very successful, so I think we managed to recycle something like 65 or 70 tons of material and take that from landfill and put it in. And when we're talking about what we're recycling here, we're talking about things like printer cartridges and old telephones and old computers. And we all know how sort of they have that built-in obsolescence, so that they're not meant to last really. You get 3 years or 4 years out of them, that's it. So
and that
it was a big story.
That project got lift off about 15, dates aren't my big thing, 15 to 20 years ago. So it's very current with
Early
this whole
2000s.
war on waste today. And at that point in time, pretty much no one was interested. I remember actually taking this really heavy lug of a chair made out of old computers and printers, literally onto trams in Melbourne so that we go visit clients, doing the same thing in Perth, people making jokes about you have to take your seat along with you on a tram and to go if another person says that to me.
So this is the finished product.
That's
by
the chair
way.
there.
That's beautiful.
But what was really interesting there was to go, there was so much resistance from so many of the people that we actually spoke to go, do you reckon this has got any potential? Almost everyone that we spoke to said no. Okay, not interested in recycling plastics. Who cares about that? It's an old design. Why would you bother doing that? And there's all this other new stuff. We'd rather use that. And this is from some of the best designers in the country. So we took the approach of going, you know what? Let's just do it anyway and take a punt on it because we've got not much to lose.
We liked it.
And we liked it.
You had them all.
And well, we didn't have it. There was a team of people from RMIT and a company called Warrington's who'd already invested all this IP, but they hadn't joined all the dots in terms of, as Marc said, sales and marketing. And then to go, all right, it wasn't a unique selling proposition. No one said they were interested. And yet when we released it to the market, very quickly what we found was that technology companies and major banks were buying this product because of that. And in spite of all the negativity that we got in the market research. So that showed to me is that, banks don't buy stuff for a feel-good factor. I mean, they do a little bit, okay, but they're as tight as they come when it comes to spending money. Let's be frank.
And they're a little bit narcissistic in that they like to look good. There's no bankers here.
We'll leave that one alone.
Yeah, exactly.
But more to go, you know what, we had really large corporates going, we want to be part of this story and we want to be able to tell this to our customers and we want to tell this to our employees. So it was a micro example of going, here's all this stuff that people thought was just crap. And here were some people doing good work and we just came along and facilitated that to get off the ground. And despite apparent indifference, it went on to become a real success. So this thing about disrupting existing models and particular orthodoxies, if there's a sense that this is just the way things are done, this is just how it's done and there isn't another way, it's like something like we're a creative lot here. Like sometimes it's really good to go, well actually, no, we're going to actually do something which actually really shakes this up. But it doesn't look like it. You look at it and you go, it's just this innocuous looking familiar chair.
Michael, I remember when you launched it, it was everywhere. Is it still in production? Because
it's still in production.
It one of your most successful pieces?
It's still in production. Yeah. And when we say that this thing of, there can be financial reward in these sorts of punts. Not that we ever did it that way, because everything said that it would fail.
Yes.
So to actually get this chair spec'd in all of Westpac's branches all through the country, the same with CBA and a number of other banks, we're talking something which we didn't expect. So not that necessarily needs to drive these things, but sometimes those punts and something like Nightingale, for instance, which is this thing of, that's the adaptive reuse of the future, to go, they're building the buildings that people will want to reuse and repurpose rather than knock down because no one wants to be in them.
That's the sort of cheap chipboard furniture that fills everybody's houses and no one's ever going to sell in an antique shop, ever. And they're just going straight to landfill because there's nothing you can do with all that stuff.
Exactly. And a figure, a really appalling figure was last year as we were preparing our submission for the Good Design Awards, to go, all right, this, our Edo furniture, the pod stuff, is meant to help reduce the amount of waste in fit out. So instead of building chip rock walls, ripping them down, to go, well, this is a small little contribution to reducing that. But how big is the problem? And I went to an EPA site in New South Wales and to see something like 2.5 million square metres of fit out space is ripped out per annum, per year, just in Sydney. had to go.
And there's this
We had
thing
no
where
idea
you,
of how big that was. And so in terms of adaptive reuse, this
yeah.
is not architecture, it's interiors, it's fit-outs. And how disposable this stuff is and how much of that just goes into landfill.
Yep. And someone builds an office building and a new office building has ceilings and carpet.
Yes.
And they're the first things that get ripped out when
Yes.
someone leases the space.
That's
right.
Can you talk them into doing
Yes.
unfinished shell?
Yes.
No.
Every 60 days.
Yes.
But look, there's some great initiative happening in the flooring market with companies like Interface, and some of their initiatives, some of their products that they're developing now, which is excellent, and they're also taking back a lot of their product and upcycling that as well. So, yeah, you mentioned your Edo range, and I was reading that you was inspired, or the inspiration of the Edo range was really from Japanese culture and Japanese streetscape, in a way of adaptive reuse or adapting a culture into a product. Can you tell us how the design process of adapting a culture into something three-dimensional, a form or a design like that?
Sure. There's probably more in common with something like Spice Alley.
Yeah.
This thing of compression of space. Like when you make a space really tight, like the classic thing, there's a party going on, where are most people? In the smaller space. Where you can actually get food.
Yep.
Okay.
In the kitchen.
In the kitchen, where there's not much room between the kitchen bench and the island bench.
It's this very human thing to kind of want to congregate and get tight when it's appropriate. Okay. The Japanese are really good at living in tight, confined spaces. So very simple. The cultural thing is really about a value system in the culture to go, all right, Japanese culture is big on taking tiny spaces, cramming people in, and you go into it and go, this feels just like the most amazing place I've been. So to go into a restaurant in Shibuya, which measures maybe 2.7 by 2.7 by 2.7, tiny, and to go, there's a kitchen included in that. And 6 people will sit around. As a stranger coming into an international city, going into such a confined space, you have to squeeze past everyone. Everyone actually needs to move out of the way to make room for you. And then to go, instead of that actually detracting from the experience, it actually enriched it.
Yeah.
And to go, I will remember those meals I had in some of those, they call them yokochos, which are just little alleyways, for the rest of my life. And to go, here's a city of 20 odd million people, everyone was talking to one another.
And there's a sustainability aspect to that as well, because instead of needing 300 square metres for that number of people, you can push it all together and have maybe 200 square metres. And that means you don't have to build the other 100. And that's, again, where your Edo furniture is really, I think, attractive, because you don't have to build corridors and escape routes and all that thing. You just plonk a pod in the middle of the space and get all of the benefits.
Yeah.
It's
And also
fantastic.
the sustainability point that you can pick it up and take it to the next tenancy after 6 years as well.
Yeah.
It's not integrated with the building.
Yeah.
Your donor doesn't have to be hit with a sledgehammer after at the end of the 6 years. You can literally take it from one building to another.
Well, this has always been one of the driving sort of ethoses behind how we work, which is that think someone once said the best sort of green building is a building that already exists, and in furniture sense, it's the same sort of thing. So we figure that the best way to make something sustainable, if it's not all made from sustainable or recycled materials, is that you make it extremely useful for a long period of time. So that means it has to be made of the right sort of materials, it has to be structurally strong, but it also has to be purposeful and useful. So if we encourage people to treat their furniture like places to live, and then they can take that, as you're saying, like the bathroom concept.
Yes.
Maybe those bathrooms in that building could be picked up and taken to the next building and refurbished, somehow along the way. This is an industry of the future, perhaps. But that's how we feel about the furniture as well. They're assets. They're not just things that suit one fit out and last for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. And I think it's great to see that industry's becoming and the market's becoming a little bit more relaxed about acoustics as well in the workplace. So therefore less need for integration and more opportunity for for product like this to define space and collaboration rather than building four walls.
And there's also the aspect of a lot of talk about sustainability tends to be about physical, environmental sustainability, and those things are really valid. As someone who who works very freely in cafes and at home and very mobile, and to go, I've had to actually go, what actually keeps me productive and sane? Okay, because this thing of being that adrift in some ways is a real challenge for a whole new generation of workers. And so to go, all right, here's a workplace where a lot of people have to spend a lot of time in. Now, how do we actually make this, and this is what architecture is all about, design is all about, how do we actually make this a space that actually is good for people? Now, that's a different type of sustainability. It's a human, sustaining the human being. What makes us happy? What makes us feel safe? And one of the things that this sort of also addresses is the sense of physical safety in an open plan office. Apparently, to look into it, to go, and Marc raised this the other day, one of the issues about open planning is that a lot of women have reported that they feel unsafe because they're a lot more exposed, and it exposes them to much more scrutiny, especially from male colleagues. So there's the sense that, all right, the human psychological needs, how are we actually sustaining the human being in this? And that's another question. You're talking about beautiful spaces. That's a deep human need for volume and space and light, and to be inspired by a space. So we need beauty, but we also need that sense of safety as well as some sense of privacy when we just don't want to be around people all the time. So
there's a bit of a trend at the moment away from the open plan linear sort of office desking concept. Like, you can have that, but you also have to be able to offer people spaces to retreat and be private.
Correct.
Like to make a phone call or to do their personal work or to get away from someone who's annoying in the office for an hour, things like that.
Without having
Out
to
of
go
interest,
to the car park to make your phone call.
You don't have to go to the car park to make a phone call.
Out of interest, are you noticing the Edo range being specified on existing building stock or new developments? Is there sort of a trend to see that more in older buildings or new buildings?
We're not getting the stats on that at the moment.
Yeah.
No, that will come as we get into it a bit more. We can investigate that.
It'd been interesting to talk a little about aesthetic durability, because a lot of that, particularly with fit outs, is not that they cease to be functional, they just don't look cutting edge anymore. And trying to get a way of
too stylised,
ensuring that durability goes forward.
Very good point.
Good. All right, well, I think it's about time for some Q&A with the crowd now.
Good.
I've been given the tap on the watch by Alice over there. So. We've got a microphone. Alice got a microphone. Can pass that around to anyone who's got some questions.
Okay.
Exercise here. Thank you. I think my question will hopefully be for all of you, but in starting with the 050 chair and how you used an existing design to sell a new concept, do you think that is something in interiors, architecture and product that is necessary in explaining new things to consumers or the public or the client? Or is it possible in Australia, because it would be maybe dependent on culture, to go all new in one big hit? Or do we need this familiarity of existing things to get a new concept across?
If I can start with that one there, I think there are always myriad ways to address any kind of challenge, and you've raised a really good one. I'm particularly interested in neuroscience, psychology, how people actually think, why they choose particular things, and it would seem to be that most of the things we do are driven from what we know and what's familiar. Most of our behaviours are repeats of what we've already done and what we've already made sense of. We tend to reject things that don't fit an existing model. That's human nature. It's not unusual. So there will always be those people who will be at that front edge. And so you know that bell curve? The early adopters will be the ones that are able to. However, the vast bulk of people in this bit here will actively, they won't even be aware of it, but they will shut out stuff that's not familiar. So sometimes it's useful to use the Trojan horse approach, which is effectively what we did. We masked it as, here's something mundane. It won't press any buttons, it won't get you excited, you won't even know it's there, but underneath it is something completely different, and if you don't care about it, that's all right. And sometimes that's a useful way to get around that sort of obstacle.
You put
Does that
some
help?
familiar hooks so that people have a bridge between the new thing and what they're expecting. They actually have stepping stones to get them across the gulf.
Yes. Yes.
And I mean, my example of that is when we first started adaptive reusing very significant heritage buildings and not painting them, just leaving the patina of, you know, cracks and mould and whatever there was there. We got such pushback of, when are you going to finish it, when are you going to paint it? Oh, it looked all right, it was done properly. And now people are faking that same patina in new buildings. So, you know, it's taken a while, but you just need that, A, perseverance, and B, having a rationale behind you that you can communicate to people. Because people are very interested in finding out about new things, and if there are sound reasons you can explain, that can often get them across the void.
I love that description of stepping stones. Like, if you give people stepping stones to help them through that process, understanding that it's a difficult thing for us to do cognitively, to actually assimilate something new. For most of us. So to go, how does someone come in to facilitate that shift by actually giving them familiar steps and then another one, as well as going, there is a place for radical disruption, because some people will get it straight away, but they'll be the minority, and that's okay. Does that help? Yeah.
It's just about how to approach this end goal of adaptive reuse.
Yes.
Bits or in one bit week. So thank you.
Well, whether it's new or it's reuse, the key thing is the message that goes with it, and thinking not whether there's more of a message with one or the other. Probably more so with the new, because, you know, the other one might be more familiar because it's reuse. But if there's no narrative to go with what you're doing, whether it's new or reuse, you know, it's going to fail.
And Todd, I just read an article yesterday to go, I think in Amazon, the business culture there, no PowerPoints. So in terms of words, no words, word-based presentations allowed at board meetings. And to go, it's all about the narrative. You need to come up with a really simple story that nails your idea and makes it really human and relatable, so that someone else can feel it, smell it, taste it, touch it, see it. Then the chances of actually that idea, this new thing getting into someone's head, is so much stronger, rather than text, idea. So that's a simple way of just overcoming, you know, the way we're wired. A really good, simple story.
Another question? Joyce?
Hi.
Hi.
I've run an furniture refurbishment business for 20 years now. Right, it's profitable. Done lots of big jobs, and the thing that I find is that we don't get a lot of support because we do so-called second-hand furniture or refurbished furniture. We don't get a lot of support, because when you're selling new furniture, you get marketing tools and lots of stuff. But when you're selling a service, you don't actually get the support from the industry nor from the designers, because they don't really understand what you do. But what I was thinking was, what if we had an industry kind of star rating for furniture, like you do for electrical appliances? So if there could be a panel, like a good type of panel with people with the qualifications who could star rate your furniture in terms of reuse, churnability, parts, installation, how long it takes, what sort of backup service you could get, take back, the whole
Love
thing.
it. Love it.
It's a great idea. You're giving another group of bureaucrats, though, another
even for
opportunity
new firm.
to charge us fees.
But
Maybe we should just delete the other bureaucrats.
But I really
we belong
like
to
that.
Gecko. I spent a lot of money on ISO 14001, 9001, Gecko. Great. I dropped out of the GBCA because I got nothing for it. I just think that, being a sole trader in this kind of industry, you get kind of lost in that. I've also got a new, furniture company as well, but I think you get lost in it because a lot of the specifiers are young and they don't really understand.
Well, people like endorsement.
What
they want
furniture,
certainty.
what the quality, what furniture is. Coincidentally, Todd.
The interesting thing about that is all of those measures that you listed, you can actually quantify unarguably.
Yeah.
It's not a subjective assessment at all. So you could actually do a star rating. You just
something that's sort of
set 7 different criteria and measure them, and out pops the answer.
similar sort of things that you do for buildings, but you do for furniture, because so much goes to landfill. Even the big names, I've seen so much stuff that people phone up and say, "Do you want this big name, brand, 10 floors of furniture that's going?" So maybe something like that might help.
People sometimes ask us questions. Sorry, did you want to say something?
No. It's just
People sometimes ask us, like, what happens to your furniture, like, in its later life? Like, do you see it being resold or recovered? And the answer is yes, we do see it from time to time. Sometimes you'll see your name pop up on second-hand sites. And what you're saying is absolutely true, is that there are things with a lot of value in them still that are being sort of treated as like downgraded commodities. Like, we did a beautiful, one example simply is that we did a beautiful custom piece for Caltex once, and these were two $25,000 leather lounges, which were huge sweeping arcs, and they were stunning pieces, and they were in there for like 3, 4, 5 years maybe. Then Caltex repurposed that space, and then they sold them on the second-hand market. They sold for $3,000 each. But the good news is that somebody actually bought them.
And just anyone who doesn't know Joyce and her company, Siho Beautiful, beautiful furniture. So we'd like to talk to you some more, but worth checking out. The stuff in the foyer area here.
Oh, that's yours.
Yep.
You can actually ship, well, this is our furniture, and they actually ship their stuff all around the world from every trade fair. And that big lamp doesn't need rigging or anything, just plug it in.
Yep.
It's beautiful.
And we're not getting a commission, by the way, but we've known Joyce for a long time.
All right, well, I think that's all we have time for. Please feel free to hang around outside and ask any other questions that you might have for the speakers. Thank you so much for your time today. It was wonderful hearing you speak.
Thank you.
Special thanks to Gaggenau, who have sponsored these Design Forum sessions, and have a wonderful day up front.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.